long after becoming the world's greatest combat pilot, rewriting the Air Force book on air-to-air combat, and leading the reform movement of military spending from within the Pentagon, which I don't even have time to include here, John Boyd became fascinated with creativity, strategic thinking, and war strategy. He read and reread multiple translations of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And of course, you can't consider yourself an expert on war strategy without studying the Austrians, the Germans, and the famous doctrines of military strategy leading up to World War I and World War II. John Boyd also read multiple translations of On War by von Clausewitz. As he compared doctrine of Sun Tzu to that of Clausewitz, he figured out that the Germans had good ideas that worked on the battlefield, but Sun Tzu's strategies could win wars before one even stepped onto the battlefield. Terrain does not wage war. Weapons do not wage war. People wage war. The real battle is over the mind of your enemy. It was Sun Tzu's deliberate use of orthodox tactics in combination with unorthodox tactics that allowed him to maneuver and surprise the enemy. The Chinese used an old term, chang, that translates to orthodox, together with another word, qi, that translates as unorthodox. To surprise your enemy, you always needed both chang and qi. He looked to see how this played out in some of the world's most famous battles. Boyd was fascinated by how a vastly superior Roman army lost to Hannibal and the Carthaginians at the Battle of Cannae. In that battle, one of the most famous in military history, Hannibal suffered only 3,000 casualties, while the Romans lost over 70,000. Hannibal pretended to focus his strength in a full frontal attack on the middle. This appeared to the Romans to be an orthodox attack, chang. But then Hannibal had his center feint a retreat, drawing the Romans into a trap. Then Hannibal used his stronger forces to envelop the Romans' flanks. This was the unorthodox, qi. Once surrounded, the Romans folded in on themselves and didn't have the room needed to fight in formation. Amidst the chaos, the Romans helped to utterly annihilate their own army. Boyd found many such instances in history. He was looking at the victories of numerically inferior forces, and in them he found a common thread. None of the victorious commanders of smaller armies ever threw their forces head-to-head against stronger enemy forces. They did not fight what was known as a war of attrition, what Boyd often called up-the-middle diddle-diddle, which led to the devastating losses on both sides as we saw in the trench warfare of World War I. Instead, guerrilla warfighters, the German panzer divisions of the Blitzkrieg, and even General Patton used deception, speed, fluidity of action, and focused their strength against the enemy's weakness. They used tactics that disoriented and confused. Tactics that, in Boyd's words, caused the enemy to unravel before the fight. General Patton, quite coarse in his colloquialisms, coined the famous phrase, "Hold them by the nose and kick them in the ass." General Rommel's tank panzer divisions struck hard and fast into the Allies' formations. To do this, Rommel had to leave his flanks exposed. But once he got the initiative and confused his enemies, he didn't need to defend his flanks. All he had to do was figure out the next move while he was still one step ahead and keep the enemy flustered. By keeping the initiative, getting a feel for what to do next, and consistently staying on the offensive, one could completely confuse and destroy the enemy. As Boyd studied German tactics, words like Fingerspitzengefühl and Schwerpunkt became everyday expressions. Neither translates into English very well. Schwerpunkt. 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 Damn, that's a hard word to pronounce.
Schwerpunkt.
Not cyberpunk. It means the main focus of effort. On a deeper reading, it is the underlying goal, the glue that holds together various units. It's the focus where you tell your captains to send their fighting force. Fingerspitzengefühl means intuitive fingertip feel. The fuller meaning applies to a leader's instinctive and intuitive sense of what is going on or what is needed in the battle or any conflict of any kind. Fingerspitzengefühl. Fingertipsengefühl.
Fingerspitzengefühl.
Damn German language! Mark Twain was right. John Boyd also remembered his own 42nd Air Combat fights, where he saw that it was his instinct for quickly switching between maneuvers that gave him advantage over his opponents. Now, before Napoleon declared himself emperor, in other words, before he became powerful and predictable, He used similar tactics to escape traps and defeat multiple armies at once. Napoleon had the uncanny ability to read the opponent's mind and lead his adversaries where he wanted them to go. He moved fast, created surprise, and kept his enemies confused. These ideas from history's greatest military strategists and hundreds of others made up the tapestry that became John Boyd's greatest and least understood legacy, the briefing titled Patterns of Conflict. The briefing begins with the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act cycle, or OODA Loop. Today, anyone can search for OODA Loop and find endless amount of conjecture on how to apply Boyd's idea to competitive arenas. The phrase has become a buzzword among military and business consultants who preach a time-based strategy. But few of those who speak about the OODA Loop or OODA Loop have a true understanding of what it means and what it can do. For a time, Boyd and his superior, Franklin Spinney, were reluctant to fully explain the OODA Loop. They were worried that it was far too dangerous. If someone truly understands how to create menace, uncertainty, and mistrust, as well as how to exploit and magnify the presence of these alarming elements, the loop can be vicious, a terribly destructive force, virtually unstoppable and causing panic and confusion. This is true whether the loop is applied in combat, in competitive business practices, in sports, or in personal relationships. The most amazing aspect of the OODA Loop is that the losing side rarely even understands what happened. Observe, orient, decide, and act. Come on, Sean, what are you talking about? This is nothing more than just a fancy way of saying, try to take action faster than the other guy. But the thing is, a person with more experience has more of instinct and doesn't necessarily have to think so much in order to get through to what it is he wants to do and how to analyze the effect it has on his enemy. A person having a fingertip feel allows the strategist with more experience to rely on instinct without having to consciously decide what to do. There is another book, Mastery by Robert Greene, which I also highly recommend, which elaborates on the idea of developing Fingerspitzengefühl. This allows him to decide and act faster than his opponent, who may still be trying to decide what action to take. When we look at the philosophy of Jeff Bezos, we also see that he talks a lot about the importance of being able to take action and make decisions quickly. Taking action more quickly allows the victor to gain the initiative. Once held, he can then proceed to orient, decide, and act with more confidence while not allowing the opponent to orient themselves to the new situation. Even if the enemy could manage to take action, he couldn't see its effect. The victor is now inside the opponent's OODA loop and exploding it from within. He can destroy the enemy's ability to respond coherently to the scenario at all. And it doesn't just work in combat. It transfers to all kinds of scenarios. In fact, John Boyd and his conspirators had learned how to use such strategies to outmaneuver their superiors politically within the Pentagon. But military doctrines at the time still centered on lining up your troops with perfect formations for predictable front attacks. Up the middle, diddle diddle. And no one suffered more from this ancient old mindset than the Marines. The U.S. Marines is a separate and distinct culture within the military. Marines are considered both primitive and elitist. Primitive because all Marines are basically infantrymen, and elitist because they are so few in number and so good at what they do. They are warriors, and for them there is no higher calling than defending their country in battle. The battle flags of these proud seagoing troops go back to the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli. They are the first to fight, and they are given the dirtiest and bloodiest assignments. Got a beach held by vastly superior forces that needs taking? A country that needs taming? Send in the Marines. Other services recruit by making promises. The Marines recruit by looking for a few good men. Almost from the beginning, the Marines have been the men who charge up a hill until they take it. Classic, up-the-middle troops who not only take horrendous casualties, but then boast about how badly they suffered. No part of the U.S. military has more esprit de corps, more respect for the military way, and more reverence for the individual than the Marine Corps. The Marine creed of Semper Fidelis, always faithful, is a living, breathing thing. When a Marine agrees to do something, looks someone in the eye and says, Semper Fi, you know he will do what he promised. The Marines are more than a national organization. They are a national institution. But John Boyd was not a Marine. He wasn't even in the Navy. He was Chair Force, a blue suit. No two branches of the American military are farther apart than the Air Force and the Marines. It is a cultural chasm almost impossible for civilians to understand. There are the obvious differences. The Air Force is the youngest branch of the military and fights its battles in the skies, a place where wars are rarely decided. While Marines, a much older branch, has been fighting as far back as the fight for America's independence in 1775. And to this day, they are still fighting in the mud, where the fate of nations and the course of history are often resolved. But there are less obvious differences as well. The Air Force is a technocracy, while the Marines are a warrior culture. This all boils down to one thing. Marines are utterly contemptuous of the Air Force. That's why it is truly amazing that John Boyd, an Air Force officer, was able to have any influence at all on the Marines when his own branch didn't even like him. In 1980, Boyd came to the Marines headquarters through the offices of an extraordinary man, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Duncan Wiley. In the 80s, at the Marine Amphibious Warfare School, Major Mike Wiley took on the task to update the Marine Corps' doctrine of accepted military tactics. Amphibious warfare is unique to the Marine Corps. It is all that keeps the Marines from being swallowed up by the Army or the Navy. Amphibious warfare is what the Marine Corps is supposed to do better than any other military organization in the world. Yet Wiley found the Marines were still teaching long linear attacks on beachheads, a tactic that produced the terrible casualties of World War II. The Marines at his school were captains and majors. They had lots of field experience and they were not reluctant to speak their minds. Major Mike Wiley wanted to do more than just teach about ancient battles and how to deal with Soviet tanks on the plains of Europe. Wiley was fascinated by the theme of armies winning against superior forces, of generals who controlled the thinking of their opposition. Unfair, asymmetric warfare. After asking around, he was told that John Boyd from the Air Force had a briefing the Major should listen to. So Major Mike Wiley called John Boyd and said, "I hear you have a theory about warfare." "It's not a theory," Boyd told him. "It's a briefing. I call it Patterns of Conflict, and it's 5 hours long." Wiley laughed. "My class only has 2 hours. I can't do it in 2. It takes 5. "Well, we don't have 5 hours. "Then you get 0. So Wiley relented. Why couldn't he stretch a class to 5 hours? Wiley opened the briefing not just to his class, but to all the amphibious warfare college students. But then Wiley panicked. What if his Marines look down on Boyd for being in the Air Force? What if the students don't find what he has to present interesting at all and give him hell? And he now has this scheduled to go on for 2 class lengths for a total of 5 hours? This could be a disaster. At the last second, he nearly canceled the event. But he let Boyd present, and the 5 hours came and went. The Marines were riveted. At the end, half a dozen of them were on their feet, fighting for Boyd's attention, asking hard and thoughtful questions, but with respect. You could see it on their face. This old man may be an Air Force puke, but he knew warfare better than anyone. 7 hours passed, and the remaining Marines had forgotten Boyd was an Air Force colonel at all. Wiley, the inside man at the Marines, worked with Boyd, the outsider, for the next decade. And together, they were the agent of change that helped the Marines to adapt Boyd's ideas on military strategy, radically changing the way Marines conduct war. Acknowledged by the Marines, the Gulf War validated many of Boyd's concepts. It was the Marines' use of maneuver warfare that helped the invasion of Iraq succeed so quickly. In fact, Dick Cheney had heard Boyd's presentation on patterns of conflict and secretly consulted with Boyd when they planned the invasion of Iraq. Yeah, that Dick, the one depicted in Vice. Great trailer, not so great movie. In Operation Desert Storm, the Marines rapidly advanced, and Iraqi army units surrendered because they were unable to react to the quick advancement. Boyd's impact upon the Marine Corps resulted in his becoming the only Air Force member with a dedicated exhibit at the Marine Corps Research Center at Quantico in Virginia. The legacy of John Boyd and the fighter mafia is not without its controversies. Old military buffs are still arguing as to whether Boyd and his boys really were in the right in their reforms, or whether the story is more legend than anything else. But even his detractors seem to argue that John Boyd's EM theory really did revolutionize the way the Navy and the Air Force evaluate aircraft. It's inspiring, regardless what the old men might argue. To hear a story of integrity about an officer who, instead of trying to become someone, chose to do something. to do what he thought was right, no matter what it cost. What will you choose? For a few good options, visit me at www.bestclassever.org.